The restaurant, 7:45 p.m. Gerald Frederick checked his watch, the diamond bezel catching the light of the five-star dining room. He was a man who equated punctuality with worth, and his strategic blind date was now 15 minutes late. Across the room, his assistant watched with bated breath as Gerald prepared to stand and leave until the heavy oak doors swung open. A small girl with dark, braided buns and a heavy green backpack walked in with the steel-eyed determination of a soldier. She didn't look for a host. She walked straight to Gerald. "Are you Gerald Frederick?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clink of crystal. Gerald went pale, his corporate mask slipping for the first time in a decade. "I am, and you are." "I'm Brown," she said, climbing into the velvet chair with a grunt of effort. She leaned in close, her eyes wide and solemn. "Mama can't come. She sent me instead." The apartment, 30 minutes earlier. Margaret Smith lay on her threadbare couch, her body racked with a fever that made the room spin. She had worked 3 double shifts at the diner to afford a dress for tonight, a night her friend promised could change everything. But as she drifted into a fitful, shivering sleep, she didn't see her daughter, Brown, quietly taking Margaret's phone to check the map. Back at the restaurant. "Your mother sent you. To a blind date." Gerald's brain struggled to process the unpolished reality sitting across from him. "She didn't want to break her promise," Brown explained, unzipping her green backpack to reveal a Ziploc bag of crackers. "Mama says if you make a promise, you keep it, even if you're shaking. I brought these to share in case you were hungry." Gerald looked at the cheap crackers on the white linen tablecloth and then at the girl's wrinkled blue dress. Something transactional in his heart cracked. "She's really sick," Brown whispered, her confidence wavering into a wobble of the lip. "She cries when she thinks I'm sleeping because we're poor. Are you going to be my new daddy so she can stop crying?" Gerald Frederick, the man who viewed vulnerability as a weakness, found he couldn't speak. The hushed clinking of cutlery and the low murmur of business deals evaporated the moment she appeared. He saw her first, a small figure in a faded blue dress, a bright green backpack a stark contrast against the muted elegance of the restaurant. Her steps were deliberate, unfaltering, as if guided by an invisible thread directly to him. His carefully composed CEO's mask faltered, a flicker of something raw and ancient crossing his pale features. The woman across from him, poised and elegant, gasped softly, drawing the attention of other diners, but his gaze was locked on the child. She stopped before him, her eyes, dark and knowing, meeting his. The world seemed to shrink to just the two of them, the cloying scent of money and ambition replaced by something akin to fear. Then she leaned in, so close he could feel the faint warmth of her breath, and whispered a single word. It wasn't a plea or a question, but an accusation, a promise, and a truth all at once. The sound was softer than the rustle of silk, yet it struck him with the force of a physical blow, rattling the very foundations of his meticulously built life. The multi-billion-dollar merger, the legacy he was crafting, the very air in his lungs, all of it suddenly hung precariously in the balance. It had been the weight of that word, whispered in a different lifetime, that had driven Margaret. A promise made in the humid, breathless air of a backstreet clinic, a promise that now felt like a lead blanket smothering her. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed with a relentless, indifferent energy as Margaret scrubbed the last greasy counter. Her shoulders ached, her feet throbbed, and the exhaustion was a living entity, coiling around her limbs, whispering temptations of surrender. Just one more double, she'd told herself for weeks, watching the dwindling numbers in her savings account, calculating how many more stacks of pancakes and cups of bitter coffee it would take. Each clatter of a plate, each shout from the kitchen, was a fresh assault on her frayed nerves. The smell of stale oil and cheap disinfectant was perpetually in her nostrils. One moment she was bracing herself against the counter, willing her trembling hands to carry the heavy tray of dirty dishes. The next, the world tilted. The fluorescent lights exploded into a blinding white, then fractured into 1,000 dizzying stars. The roar of the kitchen faded, replaced by a high-pitched whine that was entirely internal. She felt the sudden, terrifying lurch of her own body, a surrender to gravity she couldn't fight. The floor rushed up to meet her, the crash of ceramic echoing the sudden, deafening silence in her own mind as darkness claimed her. The weight of her promise, momentarily lifted, left only a void. The hospital room smelled of sterile defeat, the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen monitor counting the seconds Margaret could no longer reclaim. Watching her mother's stillness, Brown felt a shift, a hardening of the soft, childish center of her heart. The promise wasn't just a burden anymore, it was a directive. She didn't cry when she reached under the bed for the weathered green backpack, stuffing it with the heavy envelope and the single, faded photograph that served as her only map. Stealing away from the ward, she navigated the labyrinthine city alone, a small shadow against the towering steel of the skyline. The roar of the number 12 bus was deafening, its interior a blur of tired commuters who looked right through her, but Brown sat rigid, her small hands white-knuckled around the backpack straps. Every stop brought her closer to the glass and chrome fortress, where the man from the photograph lived behind a wall of silence. Her mother had collapsed under the weight of his name, but as the restaurant's gold-trimmed doors loomed ahead, Brown decided she would be the one to finally drop it at his feet. Gerald felt the sweat bead at his hairline, a cold, traitorous contrast to the dry heat of the dining room. Beside him, his assistant, Minho, was a blur of frantic, hushed efficiency, his tablet glowing like a weapon as he scrambled to cross-reference the girl's features against the cold data of Gerald's past. They were sharks in a glass tank, suddenly disrupted by a pebble that refused to sink. Minho leaned in, his voice a frantic vibration. "Sir, security is 2 minutes out, but the press is already tweeting about the mystery child at table 9. The 5-star decor, the baccarat crystal, the silver-threaded linens, suddenly felt like a stage set about to collapse. Every eye in the room was a camera, every whisper a verdict. Gerald looked at the weathered green backpack, its frayed straps a glaring insult to the polished marble floor. It didn't belong in this world of leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers, yet it held more power than any contract he had signed that year. As Minho whispered a name pulled from a dusty 2018 payroll archive, Gerald's blood turned to ice. The boardroom was a fortress, but the child wasn't trying to break in. She was already inside, and she was carrying the ruins of his carefully curated kingdom on her back. "Would you like me to write the final chapter, where Gerald has to choose between his career and the truth in the backpack?" The hospital bed was cold, the sheets tangling like burial shrouds around Margaret's legs as she surged upright. The rhythmic hiss of the monitor had been replaced by a silence so profound it screamed. "Brown!" Her voice was a raspy ghost in the empty room. The green backpack was gone, and with it, the only leverage they had against a world that had already chewed them up and spat them out. Panic, sharper and more searing than the fever still clawing at her brain, galvanized her limbs. She didn't stop to find her shoes or wait for a discharge she couldn't afford. Margaret hit the sidewalk in her thin hospital gown and tattered pajama pants, her bare feet slapping against the unforgiving pavement. The city lights blurred into streaks of hostile gold as she ran, her lungs burning with every ragged breath. She looked like a madwoman, a specter of poverty haunting the district of glass towers, but she didn't care. She could see the glowing sign of the restaurant ahead, a temple of excess where her daughter had gone to demand a debt that could never truly be repaid. Fever-bright eyes locked on the gold-trimmed doors, Margaret prepared to tear down the gates of Gerald's kingdom before it swallowed her child whole. "Would you like me to write the final confrontation, where Margaret bursts into the restaurant to find Brown and Gerald face to face?" The sleek, charcoal interior of Gerald's sedan felt like a pressurized chamber, a silent bubble of German engineering cutting through the grit of the city. Margaret sat in the back, her hospital gown tucked beneath a borrowed cashmere coat, her hand trembling as it rested on Brown's shoulder. The child, still clutching the green backpack, stared out the window with a stoicism that chilled Gerald more than any corporate litigation ever could. He drove in a trance, guided by the GPS coordinates of a world he had spent a decade pretending didn't exist. As they crossed the bridge, the gleaming spires of the financial district, the blue buildings of the skyline, receded into a hazy neon backdrop. The roads narrowed, the pavement fracturing into a mosaic of neglected asphalt. When they finally pulled up to the tenement, the headlights swept across a playground that looked more like a graveyard for childhood. A rusted slide stood bent like a broken rib cage. The swings were nothing but jagged chains draped over a crossbar, swaying in the stagnant night air. Gerald killed the engine, but the silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of a neighbor's bass and the cooling hiss of the radiator. He looked at the cracked facade of the building, where laundry hung like white flags of surrender from cramped balconies. This was the reality of Margaret's doubles, the physical manifestation of every hour she had traded for survival, while he had traded in abstractions of wealth. He looked in the rearview mirror, meeting Margaret's fever-bright eyes. The power dynamic of the restaurant had inverted. Here, amidst the peeling paint and the broken glass, his tailored suit felt like a costume, and his success felt like a theft. He realized then that the blue building, where he spent his days, wasn't a fortress of achievement, but a lighthouse that had intentionally ignored the shipwrecks at its base. For the first time in his life, the CEO had no words to negotiate his way out of the truth. Would you like me to write the final chapter, where Gerald decides how to use his power to fix what he helped break? The scent of burnt decaf and maple syrup replaced the sterile chill of the charcoal sedan. This time, there were no silk ties or mahogany barriers. Margaret sat across from Gerald in a vinyl booth that had seen better decades, her face no longer the color of ash. In the soft, unfiltered light of the morning, she looked like a woman reclaimed from the brink. Brown was busy coloring on the back of a placemat, the green backpack resting peacefully on the floor between them, its mission finally complete. Gerald listened, his expensive watch ticking loudly in the humble space, as Margaret spoke not of debts or survival, but of the life that had been stripped away by the crushing gravity of poverty. She spoke of lesson plans and the specific golden light of a classroom in autumn. She had wanted to be a teacher, to mold minds instead of scrubbing the tables of those who refused to see her. Hearing her describe the lost dream of her pedagogy degree felt like watching a masterwork being painted over with gray. Gerald realized then that his true penance wasn't just writing a check. It was ensuring that the woman who had survived the storm finally got to stand at the head of the class. Would you like me to write a final epilogue showing Margaret in her own classroom, while Gerald watches from the hallway? The ink on the teacher certification application was dry, but the skepticism in Margaret's chest remained a cold, hard knot. Across the polished surface of a desk that cost more than her hometown's library, Gerald's offer of a foundation scholarship felt less like a bridge and more like a golden cage. She watched him move through his world of frictionless glass and soft close doors, a man who solved problems with a signature. To him, her life was a broken equation to be balanced. To her, it was a jagged history of survival that couldn't be smoothed over by a sudden influx of capital. Every time he reached out to fix a detail of her transition, Margaret felt the old, familiar instinct to flinch. Was this genuine atonement, or was she merely the latest project in a billionaire's portfolio of redemption? She feared the moment the novelty of his good deed wore off, leaving her stranded in a world where she didn't speak the language of privilege. As she looked at Brown, who was beginning to treat the blue building like a second home, Margaret realized the highest stakes weren't financial. She wasn't just guarding her future. She was guarding her heart against a savior who might only be playing a part until the next merger called him away. Would you like me to write a scene where Gerald has to prove his commitment when a real crisis threatens Margaret's new path? The leather-bound folder Gerald slid across the table didn't bear the logo of a charity or the stamp of a government relief program. Instead, it was embossed with the sleek, minimalist crest of his primary investment firm. He had spent the previous night stripping the language of aid and pity from the documents, replacing them with the cold, precise terminology of a high-growth venture. He knew Margaret didn't need a handout. She needed a hand back, a return of the dignity the city had spent years eroding. "This isn't a gift, Margaret," Gerald said, his voice steady, devoid of the patronizing warmth she had come to dread. "It's a talent acquisition fund. My board specializes in identifying undervalued assets with high long-term yields. We looked at your academic transcripts from before the break, and we looked at the grit it took to raise a child while working those doubles." He paused, gesturing to the contract that outlined a full scholarship for her master in education, alongside a living stipend that would render the diner a distant memory. If I were looking at a tech startup with this much resilience and untapped potential, I'd be fighting for a majority stake. I'm simply investing in a future educator who understands the value of a promise. Margaret looked down at the pages, her fingers tracing the words Scholarship of Honor. It was framed as a merit-based appointment, a recognition of her intellectual worth rather than a band-aid for her poverty. By shifting the narrative from saving her to investing in her, Gerald had finally found the only currency she was willing to accept: respect. The blue building was no longer a fortress of exclusion. It was becoming a partner in a new kind of merger, one where the dividends would be paid out in classrooms, and the bright, steady future of a girl with a green backpack.